Hello and welcome back to Bookish, and welcome to a video which I'm going to review 3 books that I've read, 2 in February, 1 in January, that I wanted to review, but for whatever reasons, primarily because I was really busy in February, I didn't get around to reviewing. So the first one of those books I want to review is Milkman by Anna Burns. This was a book that was well covered, well reviewed last year on BookTube, and most people, I think, who read it really liked it. So this will be a fairly quick review. I did this as a buddy read with Mark from Words Everywhere. I enjoyed that experience. Mark is really awesome. That was really great. That actually made the experience that much better. Thank you, Mark, for buddy reading this with me. So this is just an excellent book, as lots of people tell you. It's written from inside the point of view of a young woman who lives in Northern Ireland, kind of at the height of the Troubles, the peak of the Troubles in Northern Ireland in the 1970s. It's pretty completely immersive. You see everything through the eyes of the main character and her point of view, and you're just kind of slowly, by being like dropped into the deep end of this story, you slowly begin to pick up on the details of life in Northern Ireland and all the ways in which there are tragedies and horrible things happening, and all the ways in which people have learned to adapt, and all these incredible nuances about the paranoia, the culture of Northern Ireland, and the paranoia in Northern Ireland during that time period. The main character is a young woman. She is, I believe, the third oldest sister in a family with a lot of girls. Her family has been affected by the violence in Northern Ireland in various ways, with brothers and brother-in-laws being caught up in that violence. But our main character has essentially, in a way, isolated herself from that in her own mind, and she kind of lives at a remove from everything, and so she's always kind of observing things, almost like observing things almost like in the third person, in the sense that she's aware of what's happening, she's aware of what's happening to her, but it's almost like almost kind of a clinical view of things, and she's not really fully engaging everything, and she's kind of separates herself, at least in her mind, from her boyfriend, from her mother, from her older sisters. There are very few people that she connects with. She's so kind of willfully oblivious of what's going on around her that she walks through the streets of Belfast, even in some of the really dangerous areas, reading a book, paying no attention to what's going on around her, but walking and reading. And this is the way she lives her life until she draws the romantic interest of a mysterious IRA-connected figure known in the book only as the Milkman, and the Milkman's unwanted attention and his unwanted focus on her as a romantic interest overturns everything in her life, and it puts her family in danger, it puts her boyfriend in danger, it puts herself in danger. It really just kind of throws everything that she's worked on, all this separation she's tried to create, it comes to an end. And in the end, she's only saved from the situation which the Milkman puts her in by a force that's stronger than the IRA and stronger than the Brits, as they would have been called, who are occupying or seem to be occupying Northern Ireland at the time. And it's a remarkable story, and it is remarkably crafted and well done. It can be a little bit hard to get into because nothing is really explained. You just kind of have to learn it as you go along and as the character experiences. But it was a very good book and a very good read. So the second book I want to review is Another Country by James Baldwin. If you've watched my channel the last couple of weeks, you know I've been gushing about this book. This is a buddy read that I did with Sean the Book Maniac, and that was a great experience. Always great to get to read books with Sean, particularly when Sean and I agreed so much about this book and were so really moved by this. This is the third Baldwin novel I've read. It's the longest one I've read, at around 440 pages. It's significantly longer than Go Tell It on the Mountain or When Beale Street Could Talk. And I've said before, and I'm going to say here in this review, that the first 90 pages of this novel are some of the best fiction I think I've ever read, if not the absolute best thing that I've ever read. And I guess it's kind of inevitable that the remaining pages, what is the remaining, oh, I can't do math, but the remaining 350 pages will be somewhat less great. That doesn't mean they're not great. They are great. The book does have highs and lows. There are some parts of the book that are not as good as others, but on the whole, it's just really great. The novel centers around an African-American musician character named Rufus King and his dealings with his friends, who in the novel are almost all white. His friends are, even though he plays in a band with African-American jazz musicians, most of his friends are white. They're writers, they're artists, they're members of that kind of community. And as such, we get to see kind of a multi-layered, really nuanced description, not through exposition, but through, Rufus's eyes, and throughout the book through the eyes of other characters, of all the different ways in which what, for lack of a better term, I'm going to refer to as the white gaze, affects African Americans and forces, or at least forced African Americans in the late 50s, early 60s to always be on guard for how they were being viewed and what people were thinking, because they never knew what kind of reaction they would draw. Rufus's friends are white liberals living in the Greenwich Village area of New York City, and yet their reactions to Rufus and his actions and his behavior oftentimes betray different approaches or different feelings among white Americans towards African Americans during the time period. And this is what Rufus is reacting to. He is an incredibly angry character. He's an intense character. But he is a fascinating and powerful character who is deeply flawed and does at least one incredibly deeply disturbing thing, which I'll kind of talk about here at the end. But he is clearly twisted and torn by the circumstance in which he lives, by the standards in which he's held as an African American man in this community and in the United States of America. And all the experiences of racism are here in this story, and all the subtle and obvious and overt and violent and passive aggressive forms of racism take their place here. In addition to being about kind of race relations, the novel also explores issues related to marriage and love, the gay community of New York City at the time period, art, the impact of money and sex on relationships. It's just a really intense, powerful read. Like I said, not perfect, but a great story. And Rufus King is just a great, great character, and his sister Ida King is equally as great. Those are the two primary African-American characters in the novel. And in some ways, what we're really looking at then is frequently the way in which the white characters interact with them. And then the way in which they interact with a gay character who's an actor, because there's some similarities and parallels there that were really interesting. There is one element of Another Country which I saw, I believe Heidi of A Reading Life read If Beale Street Could Talk this month, and she pointed out that If Beale Street Could Talk, the misogyny really bothered her. The kind of casual approach to violence against women was something that really kind of, I think she said, set her teeth on edge. And I can understand that. And I'll be honest with you, there are elements of that here too, in which we, in at least two of the male-female relationships, there's infidelity, or the feeling there's been infidelity, and then the men in those relationships react violently and strike, hit, assault the women they love or their wives. And I'm not exactly sure what Baldwin's trying to say. I'd like to tell you that one of two things is true: that he's either just reflecting the way in which relationships between men and women work during the time period, or that he's trying to show parallels, especially in Another Country, between the way in which characters view violence when an African American man hits a white woman that he's dating, and the violence when a white man hits a white wife who's been cheating on him. That maybe he's trying to make some statement there, but to be honest with you, it's not clear. And that is one of the things that I think that in this novel might make it a more difficult read for some people. But I do think for the time period, it's reflecting the time period accurately. and I don't think Baldwin is pro domestic violence or pro assault of men on women, but there are those elements in the books. So the third book that I'm reviewing tonight is this biography of George Washington, You Never Forget Your First, by Alexis Coe. I believe in my video on Saturday I said her last name was Cole, but her last name is Coe. Alexis Coe is a historian, a teaching historian, and a writer, an expert on all kinds of subjects. And in this biography, she's attempting to shed shed more light, I should say, on aspects of Washington's life that oftentimes are not the features of biographies. She asks questions, not directly, but I think they're questions she's addressing here, like, was Washington a good son? Was he a good stepfather? Was he a good husband? Was he a good businessman? Was, he a good person? And kind of addressing those kind of personal things to him or about him that she found interesting, or that she found oftentimes were overlooked in biographies of Washington. She poked some fun at some noted biographers of Washington. Ron Chernow and others come in for a little bit of razzing because of their enthusiastic gushing about Washington's physique and his rippling thighs. She kind of jokingly refers to them as thigh men because they seem to be really obsessed with Washington's thighs. She doesn't really leave out the traditional stuff, but she has a way of kind of covering it and bringing to light certain elements from Washington's life that are not. It's not that they're not known. It's not that they're not written about. But things that maybe that people don't pay that much attention to in other biographies. Like, she does things like this. Like, I don't know if you can see there, but she's essentially listed here in kind of a chart form all the diseases that George Washington had and that he survived, and the animals that he kept at Mount Vernon. And then, she has a timeline in there. One of the things I think she does that's most clever to kind of get away from the idea of just talking about Washington the general is, instead of talking about the battles and going to a long depth, she lists the battles and the results, whether he won or lost, what the impact of the outcome of those battles were. I think that's just really kind of clever. They're almost like these little, almost like pop-up windows, that you can click on if you want more information about something. I think that's really well done. I think she does a good job of addressing all the major issues in Washington's life and answering kind of all those questions, while also addressing the mainstream things like, was he a good general? Was he a good president? Was he a good slave owner? If such a thing's possible, which, by the way, if you're wondering, it isn't. She addresses all those issues too, but she does it without, gushing, I think. She does it without editorializing. She does it by presenting information and facts, which is the way to do it. She does take Washington to task for a number of things, particularly his view on slavery, his view of his slaves, his treatment of his slaves, which is not nearly as benign as I think kind of popular culture history wants us to believe. She does discuss his military mistakes. She discusses in some detail the mistakes of his second term as president. She criticizes him harshly for his handling of the Whiskey Rebellion when Washington called out troops and led them personally into western Pennsylvania to kind of crush this uprising about taxes. She is completely truthful and relatively scathing in the way in which she presents the mistreatment of Edmund Randolph at the hands of George Washington. She doesn't really pull any punches there. She does credit Washington with being an opportunistic general, a cautious president, at least in his first term, a doting, overly indulgent stepfather and grandfather, an uncle, at the very least a fond husband who really seemed to have real love and affection for Martha. She does address the issue of why he never had any kids, and I think she comes down on the idea that the diseases he had as a young man may have essentially left him sterile. She credits him with interesting things. She brings up interesting things that Washington did that they're kind of unique, like being the person who I think first bred mules in the United States of America with a particular donkey that he got from the King of Spain, I believe, after either after his presidency or after the Revolutionary War was over. There's a really kind of interesting thing about Washington that I actually didn't know, and that is that he actually had his men inoculated or against smallpox. That he had smallpox introduced to them so that they could gain an immunity to smallpox. Washington himself had smallpox and was immune, and that because of Washington's actions in trying to kind of immunize his men against smallpox, rates of smallpox in Washington's army fell from like 20% down to 2 or 3% by the time the war was over. There are all kinds of interesting stuff like that. I think Coe is at her best in kind of giving us a clear-eyed view of Washington when she kind of succinctly and definitively dismisses the idea of Washington as a reluctant slave owner, as Washington as an emancipator of his slaves. She makes it clear that that, in lots of ways, is not true, that Washington, unlike other men of his time and other Virginians, did not emancipate his slaves because he was worried about the loss of income. That on his deathbed, when he does decide to emancipate his slaves, it wasn't nearly as simple or as straightforward as that was. She depicts Washington really kind of ruthlessly going after runaway slaves and offering rewards for runaway slaves, particularly during his second term as president. It is a really entertaining read. I will say that. It's right at 200 pages. It is not an in-depth, thorough biography of Washington, but it is a refreshing point of view, a different take on the Washington presidency. I don't think she's, trying to destroy Washington's reputation. I think she's trying to humanize Washington and to show us those things about him that were flaws and that were human. There's not a lot new here. If you've read a lot of Washington biographies, you're probably not going to find a lot of new information here, but you are going to find a new point of view and some refreshing takes, I think, and refreshing perspective. I really enjoyed the book. I thought it was great, and I certainly would highly recommend it. Anyway, there you go. There are my 3 reviews. As always, look forward to your comments in the comment section below. If you read these 3 books, if you'd like to read these 3 books, if you'd like to have a discussion about that, leave me a comment. I'll be happy to get back to you on that. And as always, thank you for watching.